Howdy everybody, this is Roaming Prepper. One of the biggest questions from 2021 is, how and why did the Texas grid fail? In order to be prepared, it's good to know how the systems around us work, what their weaknesses are, because that will inform how we prepare to deal with those consequences. Let's talk about that. The problems that happened in Texas in 2021 started with the unexpected vortex that came out of the polar region. Severe freezing rain, snow, ice, and extreme temperatures all combined to cause the grid to nearly collapse. In order to go further, it's important to understand exactly what constitutes a power grid. In most states, and pretty much all over the world, any given power grid will be a combination of different energy sources. In Texas in particular, natural gas, oil, solar, wind, and nuclear all contribute to the power grid. However, natural gas is the 75% plus contributor. It has a lower carbon footprint and is prolific in the area. And it's actually in natural gas where the problem started. As the weather hit, a lot of natural gas pipeline systems started to fail. These unexpectedly cold and historic temperatures started to freeze pipelines, valve systems, and shut down compressor stations. This is what brought the natural gas to the electrical power plants in the first place. Once the electrical output was reduced, it then affected other pipelines which were relying on the electricity to keep them warm and prevent freezing. It became a very bad negative cycle, and very soon natural gas output had diminished to the point where other power types were trying to take over, but were unable to. As natural gas started to diminish, you started to see a reduction in the availability of power. To add to the burden on the grid, most people were at home running their heaters or other power systems to keep warm at home. You had an unexpectedly high demand combined with a reduced output and unexpectedly historic extreme temperatures. The system started to fail. Power plants were not able to output, and transfer stations were not able to keep up with the demand. It was a 1-2 combo punch that really caused a lot of problems. Texas is also known for having substantially large wind farms in the west and southern part of the state. The prevailing winds coming from both the Pacific and the Gulf Coast make it a prime place to have a wind farm. However, because of that extreme weather, most of the wind farms were not designed for that cold and wet an environment. They were designed for the weather they would see 95% of the time. The vortex, that was the other 5%. Water, snow, and hail hit these machines, and then during the day would thaw just enough to get liquid into the machinery. The machinery would now have moisture inside it, which would then freeze again in the nighttime. Some of these wind farms had the nodules actually catch fire. Others outright exploded into themselves. Some of them had their fan blades fall off, and others just stopped. Now you've taken two of the major contributors to Texas power offline, natural gas and wind. The video you're looking at now was taken months after the grid had been shut down. And if you notice, most of the wind farm is operating, but there are quite a few that are not turning. This is months later, folks. So this failure was severe and it was widespread. Adding to the fact, a lot of the roads were impassable, so repair crews were not able to go and get to the farms and make the repairs that were needed. With natural gas and wind shut down, Texas essentially was losing nearly half of its power sources, and this was causing a major problem. To add to the problems, The oil and gas production side further upstream started to experience problems. One, a lot of the equipment is exposed as you see here and started to freeze. In order to protect the equipment from damage, many of the wells were shut down. So even the pipelines that were free and could accept natural gas or oil had nothing coming in because they were trying to protect the infrastructure at that time. With the roads being generally impassable and really nowhere to send the natural gas and oil and gas backed off and shut itself down to prevent further damage. This just made it harder to get started again once the weather broke. The two remaining power systems, solar and nuclear, also suffered problems. As you can see in this footage that was taken after the freeze, actually 4 months after the freeze, the solar systems in Texas are quite substantial. They cover large swaths of land that were normally used for ranching. However, with the precipitation of ice, snow, freezing rain, and other elements hitting these exposed panels, many of them failed to rotate and face the sun, reducing their output because they were locked in place. Others were completely covered in precipitation, some with as much as 2 to 3 inches of snow or an inch of ice, making them inoperable. As a result, these large and substantial solar farms were unable to contribute. To add to that, if you notice, a lot of the power lines are exposed. The transfer lines are above ground, and many of them were frozen, and the lines froze and fell to the ground. In order to protect the linemen who were working on repairs, they had to shut everything down on the solar side as well. This brings us to the nuclear plants. Unfortunately, they suffered the same thing. A lot of their electrical systems that were exposed to the cold started to fail, and in order to prevent any kind of meltdown or nuclear incident, they went on a reduced output to protect the system. As a result, all 4 systems of power in the state of Texas were either diminished or shut down. The shutdowns resulted in a lot of people losing power for a significant amount of time. It's important to understand that the state of Texas is on its own grid. This is partly political and partly a relic of the Cold War because a lot of Air Force research was actually done in Texas during World War II and the years early in the Cold War. As a result, Texas is its own small grid, disconnected largely from the western and eastern interconnections. On the one hand, it protects the state from the effects of things such as hacking or EMP, but on the flip side, as we saw in the failures, it's on its own when it has problems. With all the power systems going down and reduced transfer station and power line availability, in order to prevent injury to repair people, as well as prevent more damage to the system, rolling blackouts were instituted to try to preserve what was left as repairs were made. As the state tried to recover, it summoned power companies from other states, just like it did for Hurricanes Harvey and Ike. Unfortunately, because of the weather, many of the crews were stuck on the road and unable to arrive in a timely manner. In some areas, it took as long as 2 weeks for power crews to come back, even though the power was now available and the weather had long since subsided. The weather worked against even the repair companies coming out and doing what they had to do. Upgrades and repairs are still ongoing throughout the state. It's important to understand that these are not quick repairs in many cases. The state of Texas recently instituted fines or rewards for the companies that can winterize in a timely fashion. Unfortunately, due to other factors, unavailability of personnel, and logistical and supply chain issues, the repairs are not going as fast as everyone had hoped. Friends, in order to prepare for an emergency, it's important to understand how the systems around you work, what puts them together, and what they're vulnerable to. The Texas government did not realize that all 4 of our main power systems were vulnerable to the same thing, which was extremely cold, wet, freezing weather. Sadly, that was a lesson learned the hard way. Do some homework and understand how your local grid can be supplied and how it can be affected by weather, human actions, or even acts of nature beyond our control, such as solar flares. The more you understand about your local grid, the better prepared you'll be. Godspeed and take care.